4. So that was his name, Jameson. It was not familiar to her. There were so many in the village, and the separation of male and female was so great after childhood had ended. Kira watched him stand. He was tall, with longish dark hair, neatly combed and clasped at the back of his neck with a carved wooden ornament that she recognized as the work of the young woodcarver. What was his name? Thomas. That was it. Thomas the Carver, they called him. He was still a boy, no older than Kira herself, but already he had been singled out for his great gifts, and the carvings that came from his skilled hands were much in demand among the elite of the village. Ordinary people did not ornament themselves. Kira's mother had worn a pendant hanging from a thong around her neck, but she kept it hidden, always, inside the neck of her dress. Her defender picked up the stack of papers on the table before him. Kira had watched him marking these papers meticulously as he listened to the accuser. His hands were large, long-fingered, and sure in their movements, no hesitancy, no uncertainty. She saw that he wore a bracelet of braided leather on his right wrist, and that his arm, bare above the bracelet, was sinewy and muscular. He was not old. His name, Jameson, was still 3 syllables, and his hair had not grayed. She judged him to be midlife, perhaps the same age that her mother had been. He looked down at the top paper of the stack in his hand. From where she stood, Kira could see the markings that he was examining. How she wished she could read. Then he spoke. I will address the accusations one by one, he said. Looking at the paper, he repeated the words that Vendera had said, though he did not imitate her rage-laden tone. The girl should have been taken to the field when she was born and still nameless. It is the way. So that was what he had marked. He had written the words so that he could repeat them. Painful though it was to hear the accusations repeated, Kira realized with awe the value of the repetition. There would be no argument afterward about what had been said. How often among the text fistfights and battles had begun from you said, I said, he said that you said, and the infinite variations. Jameson set the papers on the table and picked up a heavy volume bound in green leather. Kira noticed that each of the guardians had an identical volume. He opened the page he had marked during the proceedings. Kira had seen him turning the pages of the volume as Vendera had made her accusatory presentation. The accuser is correct that it is the way, Jameson said to the guardians. Kira felt stricken by the betrayal. Hadn't he been appointed her defender? He was pointing now to a page to its densely written text. Kira saw some of the men turn in their green volumes, finding the same passage. Others simply nodded, as if they remembered it so clearly there was no need to reread. She saw Vendera smile slightly. Defeated, Kira felt again the small cloth square in her pocket. Its warmth was gone. Its comfort was gone. Turning, though, Jameson was saying, to the third set of amendments. The guardians all turned pages in their books. Even those whose volumes had remained closed now picked them up and looked for the place. It is clear that exceptions can be made. Exceptions can be made, one of the guardians repeated, reading the words, his fingers moving on the page. So we may set aside the assertion that it is the way, Jameson announced with certainty. It did not always be the way. He is my defender. Perhaps he will find a way to let me leave. Do you wish to speak? The defender asked Kira. Touching her scrap of cloth, she shook her head no. He went on, consulting his nose. She was imperfect, and fatherless as well. She should not have been kept. The second repetition hurt, because it was true. Kira's leg hurt too. She was not accustomed to standing so still for so long. She tried to shift her weight to ease the pressure on her flawed side. These accusations are true, Jameson repeated the obvious in his steady voice. The girl Kira was imperfect at birth. She had a visible and incurable defect. The guardians were staring at her. So was Vendera, with contempt. Kira was accustomed to stares. She had been taunted throughout her childhood. With her mother as teacher and guide, she had learned to hold her head high. She did so now, looking her judges in the eyes. And fatherless as well, Jamieson continued. In a memory, Kira could hear her mother's voice explaining it to her. She was small then, and wondering why she had never had a father. He did not return the great hunt. It was before you were born, her mother said gently. He was taken by beasts. She heard Jamieson repeat the words of her thoughts as if they had been audible. Before her birth, her father was taken by beasts, Jamieson explained. The chief guardian looked up from his papers, turning to the others at the table. He interrupted Jamieson. Her father was Christopher. He was a fine hunter, one of the best. Some of you probably remember him. Several of the men nodded. Her defender nodded as well. I was with the hunting party that day, he said. I saw him taken. You saw my father taken? Kira had never heard the details of the tragedy. She knew only what her mother had told her. But this man had known her father. This man had been there. Was he afraid? Was my father afraid? It was a strange, unbeaten question, and she did not ask it aloud. But Kira was so afraid herself. She could feel Vandera's hatred as a presence by her side. She felt as if she were being taken by beasts, as if she were about to die. She wondered what the moments had been like for her father. The third amendment applies here as well, Jamieson announced. To the accusation, she should not have been kept. I replied that according to the third amendment, exceptions may be made. The chief guardian nodded. Her father was a fine hunter, he said again. The others at the table, taking their lead from him, murmured in agreement. Do you wish to speak? They asked her. Again she shook her head. Again she felt, for the moment, spared. But she has not contributed, Jamieson read next. She cannot dig or plant or weed or even tend the domestic beast the way other girls her age do. She drags that dead leg around like a useless burden. She is slow, he continued, and then Kira saw a hint of smile as he concluded, and she eats a lot. The man stood silent for a moment. Then he said, As defender, I'm going to concede some of these points. It is clear that she cannot dig or plant or weed or tend domestic beasts. I believe, however, that she has found a way to contribute. Am I correct, Kira, that you work at the weaving shed? Kira nodded, surprised. How did he know? Men paid no attention to the work of women. Yes, she said, her voice soft from nervousness. I help there. Not with actual weavings, but I clean up the scraps and help prepare the looms. It is work I can do with my hands and arms, and I am strong. She wondered if she should mention her skill with the thread, her hope that perhaps she could use it as a way of making a living, but she couldn't think of a way to say it without sounding vain, so she kept still. Kira, he said, looking toward her, demonstrate the you flaw for the Council of Guardians. Let us see you walk, go to the door and back. It was cruel of him, she thought. They all knew about her twisted leg. Why did she have to do this in front of them, to submit to their humiliating stares? For a moment she was tempted to refuse, or at least to argue, but the stakes were too high. This was not a Tyke's game, where arguing and fighting were expected. This was what would determine her future, or whether she had a future. Kira sighed and turned. She leaned on her stick and walked slowly to the door. Biting her lip, she dragged her aching leg step by step and felt Vandera's contemptuous eyes on her back. At the door, Kira turned and came slowly back to her place. Pain started in her foot and seared through her twisted leg. She longed to sit. She does drag her leg, and she is slow, Jamieson pointed out needlessly. I concede those points. Yet her work at the weaving shed is competent. She goes each day for regular hours, and she is never late. The women there value her help. Does she eat a lot? He asked and chuckled. I think not. Look how thin she is. Her weight refutes that accusation. But I suspect she is hungry now, he said. I am. I suggest we take a break for a meal. The chief guardian stood. Do you wish to speak? He asked Kira for the third time. For the third time, she shook her head no. She felt terribly tired. You may sit, he directed Kira and Vandera. Food will be brought. Gratefully, Kira lowered herself onto the nearby bench. She rubbed her throbbing leg with one hand. Across the aisle, she saw Vandera bow. I forgot again. I should have bowed, and then sit, stony-faced. The chief guardian glanced down at his own stack of papers. There are 5 more charges, he said. We will deal with them and make a decision after the meal. Food appeared, brought by the door guard. A plate was handed to Kira. She saw and smelled roasted chicken and warm, crusty bread scattered with seeds. She had not eaten anything but raw vegetables in several days, and had not tasted chicken in many months. But she could still hear Vandera's voice, shrill with vindictive accusations. She eats a lot. Fearful of the consequences if she showed her ravenous hunger, Kira willed herself to nibble at the tempting meal. Then she set the half-empty plate aside and sipped water from the cup they had brought. Tired, hungry still, and frightened, she stroked her scrap of cloth in her pocket and waited for the next round of accusations. The 12 guardians were elsewhere, leaving through a side door, probably to a private eating place. After a while, guards came to take her food tray away and announced a rest period. The trial would resume when the bell rang twice, they told her. Vandera rose and left the room. Kira waited for a moment. Then she made her way to the door of the council edifice, walked through the long hall, and went outside. The world was unchanged. People came and went, working at various jobs, arguing loudly. She heard shrill voices at the marketplace, women shouting outrage at the prices, vendors shouting in reply. Babies cried, tykes fought, scavenger dogs growled and menaced each other as they vied for dropped scraps. The boy Matt appeared, running past with some others. When he saw Kira, he hesitated, then stopped and came back. We got saplings for you, he whispered. Me and some other tykes, we put them in a file. Later, we be starting your cot if you want. Then he paused, curious. If you need a cot, that is, what be happening in there? So Matt knew about the trial. No surprise. The boy seemed to know everything that was happening in the village. Kira shrugged with faint nonchalance. She didn't want to let him know how frightened she was. A lot of talking, she told the boy. And she be in there? Her with horrid scar? Kira knew whom he meant. Yes, she is the accuser. She's hard, that Vandera. She killed her own tyke, they say. Made him eat the oleander, they say. Sat with him and held his head till he ate it, though he didn't want to. Kira had heard the story. It was judged an accident. She reminded Matt, though she had her doubts. Other tykes have eaten the oleander. It's a danger, having a poisonous plant grow wild everywhere. They ought to pull it all up, not leave it where the tykes can get at it. Matt shook his head. We be needing it there to teach us, he pointed out. Me, Mom, she slapped at me when I touched it. Slapped my head around so horrid hard. I thought my neck would crack. It's how I learned about the oleander. Well, the Council of Guardians judged Vandera and said she didn't, Kira said again. She's hard one, anyways. They say because of the horrid wound, pain be making her cruel. Pain made me proud, Kira thought but didn't say. When you be finished, later today, we'll work on your cot. Some of my men will help. Thank you, Matt, Kira said. You're a good friend. He made a face, embarrassed. You be needing a cot. He turned to run after the other boys. And you tell us the stories after all. You be needing a place for that. Kira smiled, watching him scamper off. The bell at the top of the council edifice rang twice. She turned to re-enter the building. She was kept against the rules because her grandfather was still alive and had power, but he is long gone. Jamieson read the next accusation on the list. They had allowed her to sit for the afternoon session, and they told Vandera to sit too. Kira was grateful. If Vandera had stood, she would have forced herself to ignore the pain in her leg and stand as well. Again, the guardian who was her defender reiterated that exception could be made. By now, frightening though the accusations were, the repetition was tiresome. Kira tried to stay alert. With her hand in her pocket, she fingered the small scrap of woven cloth and pictured its colors in her mind. The community cloth was drab, all no color. The formless shifts and trousers worn by the people were woven and stitched for protection against the sudden occasional rain, thorn scratch, or poison berry. The usual village fabric was not decorated. But Kira's mother had known the art of dye. It was from her stained hands that the colored threads used for rare ornamentation were produced. The robe worn each year by the singer when he performed the ruin song was richly embroidered. The intricate scenes on it had been there for centuries, and the robe had been worn by each singer and passed from one to the next. Once, many years before, Katrina had been asked to replace a few threads that had torn loose. Kira was only a small tyke then, but she remembered standing in the cot-shadowed corner when a guardian brought the fabulous robe and waited while her mother made the small repair. She remembered watching, fascinated, as her mother pushed a bone needle with thick, colorful thread through the fabric. Gradually, a bright gold replaced the small frayed spot on one sleeve. Then they had taken the robe away again. At that year's gathering, Kira remembered, both she and her mother had peered from their seats at the stage, trying to find the repaired place as the singer moved his arms in gestures during the song. But they were too far away, and the repaired spot was too small. Each year that followed, they had brought the ancient robe again to her mother for small repairs. One day, my daughter will be able to do this, Katrina had said one year to the guardian. Look what she has done, she said and showed him the scrap that Kira had just completed, the one that had composed itself so magically in her fingers. She has a skill far greater than mine. Kira had stood silently, embarrassed but proud, as the guardian examined the threading she had done. He made no comment, simply nodded and returned the small piece to her, but his eyes had been bright with interest, she could see. Each year following, he had asked to see her work. Kira always stood at her mother's side, never touching the fragile ancient cloth, marveling each time at the rich hues that told the history of the world, golds and reds and browns, and here and there, faded pale, almost reduced to white, there had once been blue. Her mother showed her the faded places that remained of it. Her mother did not know how to make blue. Sometimes they talked of it, Kira and Katrina, looking at the huge upturned bowl of sky above their world. If only I could make blue, her mother said. I've heard that somewhere there is a special plant. She looked out at her own garden, thick with flowers and shoots from which she could create the golds and greens and pinks, and shook her head in yearning for the one color she could not create. Now her mother was dead. Now her mother is dead. Kira started herself out of the daydreamed memory. Someone was saying those words. She made herself listen. And now her mother is dead. There is even reason to think that her mother may have carried an illness that will endanger others. And the women need the space where their cot was. There is no room for this useless girl. She can't marry. No one wants a cripple. She takes up space and food, and she causes problems with the discipline of the tykes, telling them stories, teaching them games, so that they make noise and disrupt the work. It dragged on. The repetitions of Vandera's accusations were recited, and the defender again and again reiterated the amendment that said exceptions could be made. But Kira noted a change of tone. It was subtle, but she perceived a difference. Something had taken place among the Council of Guardians when the members had withdrawn during lunch. She saw Vandera shift uneasily in her seat and knew that her accuser noticed the difference too. Kira, clutching the cloth talisman in her pocket, became aware suddenly that its warmth and comfort had returned. During her infrequent leisure times, Kira often experimented with colored bits of threading, feeling the excitement in her fingers as her surprising skill grew. She used bits of discarded woven cloth from the weaving shed. It was not a violation. She had asked permission to take the scraps to her cot. Sometimes, pleased with what she had done, she showed her work to her mother and received a proud, quick smile of approval. But more often, her efforts were disappointments, the uneven products of a girl still learning. Usually, she threw her experiments away. This one, the one she held now in the nervous finger of her right hand, she had done as her mother lay still. Seated helplessly by the side of the dying woman, Kira leaned forward again and again to hold the container of water to her mother's lips. She smoothed her mother's hair, rubbed her cold feet, and held the trembling hands, knowing there was nothing more she could do. While her mother slept restlessly, Kira sorted the dyed threads in her basket and began to weave them into the cloth scrap with the bone needle. It soothed her to do so and passed the time. The threads began to sing to her, not a song of words or tones, but a pulsing, a quivering in her hands, as if they had life. For the first time, her fingers did not direct the threads, but followed where they led. She was able to close her eyes and simply feel the needle move through the fabric, pulled by the urgent, vibrating threads. When her mother murmured, Kira leaned forward with the water container and moistened the dry lips. Only then did she look down at the small strip of material in her lap. It was radiant. Despite the dim light in the cot, it was night-starred by then. The golds and reds pulsated as if the morning sun itself had slid and twisted its rays into the cloth. The brilliant threads crisscrossed in an intricate pattern of loops and knots that Kira had never seen before, that she could not have created, that she had never known or heard described. When her mother's eyes opened for a final time, Kira had held the vibrant piece of fabric so that the dying woman could see. Words were beyond Katrina by then, but she smiled. Now, secret in her hand, the cloth seemed to speak a silent, pulsing message to Kira. It told her there was danger still, but it told her also that she was to be saved. 5. Kira noticed for the first time that a large box had been placed on the floor behind the seats of the Council of Guardians. It had not been there before the lunchtime break. As she and Vendera watched, one of the guards, responding to a nod from the chief guardian, lifted the box to the table and raised its lid. Her defender, Jamieson, removed and unfolded something that she recognized immediately. The singer's robe. Kira spoke aloud in delight. This has no relevance, Vendera muttered, but she too was leaning forward to see. The magnificent robe was laid out on the table in display. Ordinarily, it was seen only once a year, at the time when the village gathered to hear the ruin song, the lengthy history of their people. Most citizens, crowded into the auditorium for the occasion, saw the singer's robe only from a distance. They shoved and pushed, trying to nudge closer for a look. But Kira knew the robe well from watching her mother's meticulous work on it each year. A guardian had always stood nearby, attentive. Warned not to touch, Kira had watched, marveling at her mother's skill, at her ability to choose just the right shade. There, on the left shoulder, Kira remembered that spot where just last year some threads had pulled and torn, and her mother had carefully coaxed the broken threads free. Then she had selected pale pinks, slightly darker roses, and other colors darkening to crimson, each hue only a hint deeper than the one before. And she had stitched them into place, blending them flawlessly into the edges of the elaborate design. Jameson watched Kira as she remembered. Then he said, "Your mother had been teaching you with the art." Kira nodded. "Since I was small," she acknowledged it aloud. "Your mother was a skilled worker. Her eyes were steadfast. They have not faded. She was careful, Kira said, and thorough. We are told that your skill is greater than hers, so they knew. I still have much to learn, Kira said. And she taught you the coloring as well as the stitches? Kira nodded, because she knew he expected her to. But it was not exactly true. Her mother had planned to teach her the art of the dyes, but the time had not yet come before the illness struck. She tried to be honest in her answer. She was beginning to teach me, Kira said. She told me that she had been taught by a woman named Annabelle. Annabella now, Jameson said. Kira was startled. She is still alive? And 4 syllables? She is very old. Her sight is somewhat diminished, but she can still be used as a resource. Resource for what? But Kira stayed silent. The scrap in her pocket was warm against her hand. Suddenly, Vendera stood. I request that these proceedings continue, she said abruptly and harshly. This is a delaying tactic on the part of the defender. The chief guardian rose. Around him, the other guardians, who had been murmuring among themselves, fell silent. His voice, directed at Vendera, was not unkind. You may go, he said. The proceedings are complete. We have reached our decision. Vendera stood silent, unmoving. She glared at him defiantly. The chief guardian nodded, and 2 guards moved forward to escort her from the room. I have a right to know your decision, Vendera shouted. Her face twisted with rage. She wrested her arms free of the guard's grasp and faced the council of guardians. Actually, the chief guardian said in a calm voice, you have no rights at all, but I am going to tell you the decision so that there will be no misunderstanding. The orphan girl Kira will stay. She will have a new role. He gestured toward the singer's robe, still spread out on the table. Kira, he said, looking at her, you will continue your mother's work. You will go beyond her work, actually, since your skill is far greater than hers was. First, you will repair the robe as your mother always did. Next, you will restore it. Then your true work will begin. You will complete the robe. He gestured toward the large, undecorated expanse of fabric across the shoulders. He raised one eyebrow, looking at her as if he were asking a question. Nervously, Kira nodded in reply and bowed slightly. As for you, the chief guardian looked again at Vendera, who stood sullenly between the guards. He spoke politely to her. You have not lost. You demanded the girl's land, and you may have it. You and the other women. Build your pen. It would be wise to pen your tithes. They are troublesome and should be better contained. Go now, he commanded. Vendera turned. Her face was a mask of fury. She shrugged away the hands of the guards, leaned forward, and whispered harshly to Kira, You will fail. Then they will kill you. She smiled coldly at Jameson. So that's it then, she said. The girl is yours. She stalked down the aisle and went through the broad door. The chief guardian and the other council members ignored the outburst, as if it were merely an annoying insect that had finally been sweated away. Someone was refolding the singer's robe. Kira, Jameson said, go and gather what you need, whatever you want to bring with you. Be back here when the bell rings 4 times, and we will take you to your quarters, to the place where you will live from now on. Puzzled, Kira waited a moment, but there were no other instructions. The guardians were straightening their papers and collecting their books and belongings. They seemed to have forgotten she was there. Finally, she stood, straightened herself against her walking stick, and limped from the room. Emerging from the council edifice into bright sunlight and the usual chaos of the village central plaza, she realized that it was still mid-afternoon, still an ordinary day in the existence of the people, and that no one's life had changed except her own. The summer start day was hot. Near the edifice steps, a crowd had been gathered to watch a pig slaughter behind the butcher's. After the choice parts were sold, scraps would be thrown. People and dogs together would shove and grab. The smell from the thick mounds of excrement beneath the terrified pigs, and the high-pitched squeals of terror as they awaited death, made Kira feel dizzy and nauseated. She hurried around the edge of the throng, making her way toward the weaving shed. "You're out! What happened? Did you go to the field? To the beasts?" Matt was calling to her in excitement. Kira smiled. His curiosity appealed to her. It matched her own. And behind his wildness, he had a kind heart, she thought. She remembered how he had acquired his pet, his little companion dog. It had been a useless stray underfoot, scavenging everywhere for food. For a rainy afternoon, it had been caught and tossed by the wheel of a passing donkey cart. Badly injured, the dog lay bleeding in the mud and would have been left to die unnoticed. But the boy hid it in nearby shrubbery until its wounds had mended. Kira had watched from the weaving shed each day as Matt stealthily crept in to feed the animal while it lay healing. Now the dog, lively and in good health despite a tail as crooked and useless as Kira's leg, stayed constantly at Matt's side. He called it Branch, named for the small tree part he had used to splint its damaged tail. Kira reached down and scratched the homely mongrel behind his ear. "I'm let go," she told the boy. His eyes widened. Then he grinned. "So we will still be getting stories, me and my match," he said with satisfaction. "I seen Vandera," Matt added. "She come out like this." She scampered to the steps of the edifice and stalked down them, face haughty. Kira smiled at the imitation. "She be hating you now for certain," Matt added cheerfully. "Well, they gave her my piece of land," Kira told them, "so she and the others can make a pen for their tykes the way they wanted. I hope you didn't already start on a new cot for me," she added, remembering that he had offered. Matt grinned. "We didn't start yet," he said. "Soon we would have, but if you send to the beasts, then there'd be no need." He paused, rubbing Branch with his dirty bare foot. "Where are you to leave then?" Kira slapped at a mosquito on her arm. She rubbed at the little smear of blood from its bite. "I don't know," she admitted. "They told me to come back to the edifice when the bell rings for. I'm to gather my things." She laughed a little. "I don't have much to gather. My things were mostly burned." Matt grinned. "I saved you some things," he told her happily. "I filched them from your cot before the burning. Didn't tell you before. I waited to see what be happening to you." Down the patch, beyond the pig slaughter, Matt's mate called him to hurry and join them. "Me and Branch must go along now," he said. "But I be bringing the things to you when the bells go for. To the steps, aye?" "Thank you, Matt. I'll meet you at the steps." Smiling, Kira watched him go, his thin, scabbled legs churning in the dusty path as he ran to join his friends. Beside him, Branch scampered, his broken stub of a tail wagging crookedly. Kira continued on through the crowds, past the food shops and the noise of bickering, bargaining women. Dogs barked, a pair of them snarled, facing each other with bared teeth in the path, a dropped morsel between them. Nearby, a curly-headed tyke eyed both dogs warily, then deftly leaped between them, seized the bit of food, and stuffed it into his own mouth. His mother, intent on her business at a nearby shop, glanced around, saw the tyke near the dogs, and seized him away, yanking at his arm and administering a sharp slap to his head when he was back at her side. The tyke smirked, chewing eagerly at whatever he had picked up from the path. The weaving shed was farther along, mercifully in a shady area surrounded by large trees. It was quieter there and cooler, though the mosquitoes were more numerous. The women in the shed, seated at looms, nodded to Kira as she approached. "There's plenty scraps to gather," one called and gestured with her head as her hands continued work. It was the job that Kira usually did, the tidying up. She was not permitted to weave yet, though she had always watched carefully how it was done and thought that she could have, if they needed her. She had not been at the weaving shed in many days, not since her mother's illness and death. So much had happened, so much had changed. She assumed that she would not be returning now, that her status seemed different. But because they had called her in a friendly way, Kira moved through the shed, through the clatter of the wooden looms at work, and picked up the scraps from the floor. One loom was silent, she noticed. No one was working there today. Fourth from the end, she counted. Usually Camilla was there. She paused by the empty loom and waited until a nearby worker had stopped to reset her shuttle. "Where is Camilla?" Kira asked curiously. Sometimes, of course, the women left briefly to wed, to give birth, or simply assigned to some other temporary tasks. The weaver glanced over, her hands still occupied. Her feet began to move again on the treadle. She fell, took a clumsy fall, over at the streams. She gestured with her head, doing washing. The rocks were mossy. Yes, it's slippery there, Kira knew. She had slipped herself sometimes at the stream, at the washing place. The woman shrugged. She broke her arm real bad. Can't be fixed, can't be made straight. No more good for weaving. Her hubby tried real hard to straighten up the arms, 'cause he needs her, for the tykes and such, but she'll probably go to the field. Kira shuddered, imagining the torturing pain of the broken arm as the hubby tried to pull it into a healing shape. She has 5 tykes, Camilla does. Now she can't care for them or work. They'll be given away. You want one? The woman grinned at Kira. She had few teeth. Kira shook her head. She smiled wanly and continued down the aisle between the looms. You want her loom? The woman called after her. They'll be needing somebody to take it. You're probably ready to weave. But Kira shook her head again. She had wanted to weave once. The weaving women had always been kind to her, but her future seemed different now. The looms clattered on. From the shade of the shed, Kira noticed that the sun was lower in the sky. It would soon be the ringing of 4 bells. She nodded goodbye to the weaving women and headed back along the path toward the place where she had lived with her mother, the place where her cot had long stood, the place of the only home she had ever known. She felt the need to say goodbye.